I studied all week, and Carl Jones and I talked this week just to make sure I'm right about some of this kind of stuff. But as I studied, and God just began to walk through my heart, and I was challenged because you know what? I forgot the agony of the cross. I forgot the pain of the cross. And as I walked through this, I began to realize that, look, you know what the cross is about? The cross. Let me explain to you where the cross came from. The Persians invented the crucifixion. Okay? They joined forces with the Carthaginians, okay, who were bound and determined to destroy Rome. And so the Carthaginians used to crucify people on the side of the road, and in the towns they'd put them on the hills to intimidate other provinces, other territories. As people would travel, they'd see these crosses, and they knew that the Carthaginians had come through, and they would say, you know what? If we keep our loyalty to Rome, this is what will happen to us. And it was the Carthaginians' way of causing these people to forsake their loyalty to Rome and give their loyalty to the Carthaginians as they moved through the territory. So the Romans were subject to that cross, and they picked it up. And then we get to Jesus' day, and they're crucifying people not for loyalty, but it was a way that Rome crucified criminals, foreigners. Okay, Romans wouldn't be crucified. Jews, foreigners, criminals, the worst of the worst were the ones that the Romans were putting on a cross. And it was their way of saying, if you do this crime, you get this punishment. If you do this crime, you get this punishment. For the Romans, it was all about humiliation. It was all about humiliating in the worst, the cruelest, the most brutal way that they could kill a person. As an example. Okay? We look at the story of Jesus. I'll walk you through some of it this morning. They take him to Pilate. Much is said about what Pilate's role is. You know what? Pilate was just chicken. He was just scared of his job. He didn't have the courage or the guts to stand up for truth. He didn't even know truth. He was a pawn being played by people above him, and he was scared to stand up. Everything that happened to Jesus happened under the watchful eye of Pilate. I watch these movies, and he retreats to this inner chamber, and he comes back out. You know, they've glorified that. He watched. He directed the whole deal. He comes to, Jesus is brought to him, and he says, you know, this man is innocent. And the riot was about to happen, and Pilate, scared for his job, says, I find no fault in him, but I wash my hands of it. Do what you want to do. And he gave him over to it, to be crucified. And then he watched. He ordered him. It says that he gave him over to be crucified, and then he ordered for him to be scourged and crucified. Pilate was after humiliating Jesus to the point that no one could call him King of the Jews, and no one would give credibility to this thing that called the Messiah. Pilate didn't want another riot. He didn't want to lose his job. And he was a part of the plan, one that God was carrying out to his people, because it says these things occurred so that Scripture may be fulfilled. But let me tell you about the crucifixion. Okay? Crucifixion, most of the time, the vertical pole stayed in the ground. Okay? For the Romans, most of the time, majority of the time, the vertical pole stayed in the ground because they crucified all the time. And they would put these criminals on the cross. And so when they were left or dismissed to be crucified, they were given the horizontal pole. Okay? And they would carry the horizontal pole. We see in, different people have different opinions. We see in things where Jesus carried the whole cross. They estimate that cross would have weighed somewhere between 400 and 600 pounds. And to carry that through the crowd would have been impossible. Most scholars believe he carried the the horizontal pole. Okay? Still weighing some 200 pounds. He carried the horizontal pole after being beaten, scourged, mocked. It says Pilate had these execution squads that carried these things out. And the execution squads were very gifted. They were very skilled at beating a man to the point that he would almost die, but that he could make it to the cross, and he would die on the cross. They didn't want him dying on the way to the cross. Jesus had gone through sleepless nights. He'd gone through being mocked. It says when they led him into the praetorium, that the soldiers greeted him by a slap in the face. They put a blindfold on him. They stripped him naked, put a robe on his back, mocked him, spit in his face with a blindfold on, saying, "Prophesy who hit you. Prophesy who spit on you." All along, he could have called every name, pointed to every person, but he took it. His ears intunely tuned to the Father, as the Father says, "This is why I sent you, Son. I need you to do this." He kept moving forward. When they got him to the place of the cross of crucifixion, they would lay him on the ground on the horizontal pole, and they would nail each hand through the wrist to the cross. If you remember in Scripture, it says that they took and gave him, during his beating, they tried to give him wine and gall. You remember that? Okay? That's really myrrh, wine and myrrh, but it was a sedative. And as I read back through some of the history recorded, they gave him tried to give him a sedative. Most of the thieves had to have it, because when they began to nail him to the cross, it was so painful, they couldn't even hold a person down to get him nailed. To drive that nail through that wrist was so painful, most of the time they couldn't hold him down without sedating him. And they gave Jesus, remember what he did? He tasted it and he said, "No. My Father says I take the full punishment in this plan." And they nailed both hands to the cross. See, they either tied you or nailed you to the cross, depending on how long they wanted you to suffer. They get you nailed, they hoist you up the vertical pole. Can you imagine how painful that would have been? Nailed to the cross, they hoist you up the pole. There usually was a hole in the center of the vertical pole and a hole in the center of the horizontal pole. They pinned it to hold it together. Then they took each foot and they nailed each foot to the cross. The pain so excruciating, they said that if it wasn't the pain in your wrist and in your arms, which made you push up on the cross to relieve the pain in your arms, but when you did, the pain was so excruciating in your feet that you had to go back down to relieve the pain in your feet. You had to push up to breathe, even catch a breath, but they said the only thing you could catch would have been short breaths. Relieve the pain in your arms, relieve the pain in your feet. Pain in your arms, pain in your feet. To the point that the body became so exhausted that the muscles cramped. And they said for some people the muscles would cramp to the point that it would pop out of joint. Folks, I'm not wanting to be gross and cruel. I just want you to understand this morning, I forgot what he went through for me. What he went through in obedience to his Father's plan to redeem me and you. I forgot the price that was paid for me. Some people stayed on the cross as many as 5 days before they died. Going through that kind of pain. As I walk through and just listen to the story of the cross again in my life, so amazed at Jesus' focus. Father, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing.